Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you everyone for turning out on what is not a very pleasant evening, certainly by Greek standards. It would be acceptable in Britain, but not here. What I'm going to try and do is I should first of all say this is not new work. This is work that I actually did a number of years ago, but I thought it might be interesting just to give you some background about why I, as Maria said, essentially a prehistorian, became interested in this particular period and this particular type of work, but also just to show you some of the potentials that I think exist for combining textual and archaeological data, textual and material data. And that's, if you like, that is the sort of thread that runs through my work from prehistory to the near present. So I'm going to start off just by explaining a little bit about that, academic risk-taking as I find it, because I'm not trained as a historian or as an Ottomanist or as a Venetian specialist. A little bit about the context in which this work took place, which was part of the Pylos Regional Archaeological Project, which I will now refer to as PRAP, which was a long-term study of a particular landscape of southwestern Messenia, and then take you through some of the, I hope, slightly amusing adventures that some of us had in trying to locate the places that were presented to us on this Ottoman document in the contemporary Messenian landscape. I'll talk just a little bit at the end about continuities, because as you'll discover, and you probably know, that the Morea or the Peloponnese in this particular period, the end of the 18th century, went from Ottoman control to Venetian control, and then early on in the 18th century back to Ottoman control. So it was Ottoman, Venetian, and then Ottoman again. And I think some of the continuities across those seemingly major historical transitions are quite interesting. So, why on earth would I go from the stuff in the top left, about 1200 BC, Linear B, tablet from Pylos, to a early 18th century document from 1716, or in the Islamic calendar 1128? And as I said at the beginning, the answer really is because the challenges, in some senses, are very similar. One of my interests in Linear B was in place names, in trying to tease out the way in which documents which come in a sort of, if you forgive the pun, a linear fashion, can be translated into the sort of real world of the landscapes that we study. And it's I think no accident really, or it's certainly of interest that Ventris and his decipherment of Linear B, one of the keys to that was in fact the identification of place names in the text, i.e. where they were, and then using those names, as you see at the very bottom there, that he deduced that they must have continued from earlier times into the period of the documents, and therefore were very likely to be present, and so those were a sort of key, if you like, for that. Now, when one trying to work with text to pinpoint geography, there are a sort of number of different ways. I mean, one of the most obvious ways, if you know a place name and you know where it is in modern space, that's a fairly easy way of dealing with it. Less easy is to try and reconstruct relative geographies by associations, so relative locations. Places that are close together in a list on a document might well be located close together in real space. And then other sort of more general things are geographical terms, which might give us some insight into the way that people divided space up and thought about it, and how that relates with the topography of the landscapes we're looking at. So just very briefly, in case anyone's unfamiliar with the regions we're looking at, we want to look at Messenia in the bottom left there, and focus mainly on Messenia. But I may say, if there's time, if I don't run out of time, a little bit about work on Kythera, which is in some senses very similar, but also in some senses slightly an inverse of what we did in Messenia. Now, in terms of late Bronze Age Pylos, my interest in geography relate to trying to reconstruct the geography of the kingdom that was centered on the site of Pylos. And Pylos, in fact, that's circled in blue there, is the only fixed point. It's the only geographical name that we know where it is in modern space, and we have it on the documents. There are other names that occur in the documents, like Erymanthos, Olympia, Lucy, Leuctron, and so on. But we, for various complicated reasons, which I can't go into, don't believe those are actually necessarily in the same place in the Bronze Age. But we can make a fair stab at reconstructing the boundaries of that polity as suggested by the red line there. Now, I'm not going to talk about Bronze Age Pylos, so I have to stop myself rigorously from going on about it. But one point about the documents is that there are some references in the text which suggest a geographical structure based around topographical features. So if we take a nice Admiralty pre-GIS representation of the region from the Admiralty handbooks from close to the Second World War, this range of mountains, the nowadays called the Agalian Range, runs across the region and is a very prominent landmark, as you'll agree. And as it happens, we have a number of texts which distinguish between a region which is this side of, that's the one at the bottom, Deuro Aigolea, as we say in Linear B, or Dewero Aikoraya, as it comes out, and the other one beyond Aigolaion, Per Aigolaya, and it seems very likely that this refers to the territory this side of, the side we're looking at in the slide in the top right, and beyond that particular region. And that sort of raises an interesting point about the way in which people in pre-modern times engaged with landscapes in geographical terms. We think of a way of engaging with landscapes, although it's changing, I suppose, with sat-navs and what have you. But essentially, many of us are familiar with reading a map, and a map is an abstraction. It's a vertical representation of space. It has lots of conventions embedded in it. It's not, in any sense, a sort of real presentation of space. And we might think of that as a plan view way of engaging with landscapes. Another one is an itinerary form, which is used, certainly used to be used in the States for triptychs that you used to get, which would give you the list of all the places you went to from A to B in a linear fashion. And it was, of course, used in Roman maps, which did essentially the same thing. You've got putting a table there in the middle. But when people engage with landscape, and I think we can see this in the terminology of the late Bronze Age in Pylos, but also in some of the practices we'll see in a moment in 18th century Messenia and also Kythera. The idea of landscape is much more associated with being in the landscape, moving through it. It's a conceptual, or in some senses a performative way of dealing with landscape. One doesn't describe, one can describe in words how to get somewhere. One can show someone by moving through the landscape to that place, but one doesn't represent it in a plan view, nor necessarily in an itinerary. And this, in some senses, has a relationship to the distinction in geography and anthropology between notions of space, sort of relatively abstract, measured representations of space, of space, okay, versus place. Places within the landscape which have meaning, often ritual meaning, associations, historical meaning, etc., but are not about simple measurement or so on. So, in the context of PRAP, the Pylos Regional Archaeological Project, Jack Davison and myself, that's us down at the bottom right in case you don't recognise us, teamed up with an Ottomanist, Farina Zarinabaf, who's now at University of California, Riverside. She was in Chicago at the time. And we were particularly interested when we first finished PRAP to produce a fairly large-scale, broad narrative across long periods of time, which we did in Sandy Pylos, which was published first in 1998, and then, as you see there, in a second edition in 2008, I think, if I remember rightly. But the idea, but it was in that context that I got interested in particular, and Jack as well, in thinking about this 18th century document, which was brought to us by Fariba for this particular area. So these are just a couple of views of the landscape. It's particularly characterized by the bay, Navarino Bay down here, and you're looking across Navarino Bay from the north here. There are two fortresses, the old fort, Anavarini Atuk, as it appears in Ottoman, and then the new fortress, Niokastro, or Anavarini Jadid, in Ottoman, and so on. So you're looking west, to the west, over many of the places that we looked at, and from the north down to Pylos, with a characteristic mountain behind it, Aios Nikolaos. History, I probably don't need to bother, but just very briefly, around 1500, the Morea, or Peloponnese, was conquered by the Ottomans. 1685, there's a Venetian reconquest, ratified by the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699. 1715, Ottoman reconquest again, ratified by the Treaty of Pisarovitz in 1718. 1827, of course, the Battle of Navarino, and then the formation of the Greek nation-state shortly thereafter. So we're particularly interested in the period between the Venetian conquest and the Venetian conquest and the Ottoman reconquest in 1715. Now, the document that we looked at, and I'm just going to show you it in just a little bit of detail so you kind of understand the nature of the information that it offers and its structure and so on, and what we were actually working with. It's Mufassal Defter, which means it's a full defter, full document describing essentially the taxable property in this particular region. The region is referred to Anavarin in Ottoman. Navarino is its modern equivalent. And it's pages 78 to 101 of this particular document that deal with this particular area. It gives us detailed information about 49 properties, a fortress, or two fortresses actually, Calais, a number of villages, Carrières, they appear as an Ottoman, Chorio is the Greek, of course, various Chiflikia, and several Mazraa, which are uninhabited, sometimes deserted areas, but used for agricultural land. It's dated to 1128 in the Islamic calendar, 1716, specifically to the 15th of January in that particular year. And here's the first entry on the right. You can see the layout. It might be difficult to read, but it's quite nicely laid out. There's an overall heading, which tells us that this is about the Kaza, the district of Anavarin. And then each individual property has a little heading which tells you a little bit about its status and so on. The first one happens to be a property called Ali Hodja, which is clearly a personal name. That's then followed by a list of the real property, which I'll give you a flavour there: houses, oil press, houses again, more houses, rooms, large barrel, Fuji, presumably pithos, pithari. The large earthenware jars, the coupe, are pitharia, oil press, etc., listed in detail there. And then the people, the ordakçan as they're called in Ottoman, the sharecroppers, the people who are working the property and live there, working it on behalf of the Ottoman authorities, and the names are filtered, of course, through Ottoman Turkish. So we have Michali, we have Adamir, not quite sure what's behind that particular name. Tudori is Todoris, and Yani, of course, is Yanis, and so on. So four households there with information about some of their own property, shift of land, shift is a land measure, and so on. Because this is a tax document and it's a reconquest and a sort of an establishment of the tax base, if you like, following the reconquest, there's then a list of all the potential products from this particular area, split into two types of income, if you like, a sort of rent, an income in money, as opposed to an income in kind, ushur is the way it's called. And you'll notice that some of them are blank, and some of them are blank because they haven't yet assigned the actual amounts. The total tithes, as it says, have not been set apart. Just point out this last one down here,
Badi Khava, this is, goes back to Byzantine period. In many Ottoman areas in the Balkans, there's a lot of continuities from earlier regimes. It's the aeriko, the tax on air in Byzantine terminology. There's then a sort of ready reckoner which allows you to compute how much you can get of various products, wheat, barley, fodder, and millet, and so on. It doesn't appear with every entry, but it does with this one, and it appears in different categories of land. And then finally, at the very bottom, there's this list, which tells you the boundaries of the property. And this is rather interesting because I think I'm right that this is a relatively new feature in this format in Ottoman registers. And this was what started to get my interest going. I'm easily interested, as you can see, because it seemed to me that these were microplace names. So there was the possibility of actually being able to identify not just the centre, if you like, where this particular property was centred, but also the boundaries on the ground using these place names. Now, as I say, they're filtered through Ottoman Turkish, so they don't look very Greek, but in fact, Çurukdun almost certainly sits behind Hondrovuni, and we know this is a place name in the region. I'll tell you why we know that in a second. Klurun, I'm afraid we couldn't do anything with. Vithismeta is behind Vithismadun. Mavrilichna is clearly Mavrilimni, and Evluyol is a description. It means road with the house, and so on. So these places are clearly marking the boundaries of this property. So in the book that we published, which is actually here, our goal, there it is on the left, our goals were to try and identify on the ground, so to bring this information to bear in real space, as it were, on the ground, with those places, to try and locate as many of the boundary place names as we could. And we did this by talking to local informants, both directly and indirectly, by making use of 17th and 18th century and also 19th century maps of the area, pre-modern maps of the area. And as I mentioned, we're dealing with 49 properties, but as many as 250 of these individual place names that form the boundary of these properties. We know quite a lot about the process of compilation of this document. I could go into it later, but it is quite interesting because it seems that this is a document which relates directly to the time of the collection of the information. There is another fair copy in Ankara which is differently arranged. We know that two men called Süleyman Efendi and Abdul Kadir Efendi, with 10 assistants, gathered the information, and you can see interference between Ottoman and Greek as they were collecting it. So sometimes they translate Likovuni, Wolf Mountain, as Kurtai, so they translate it into Ottoman, or they simply give it as a transliteration, Likovun, and so on. And we can also see, because of the way the place names are grouped, that they probably had daily stints in which they were actually collecting those information. And just going back to what I was saying about space and place and different ways of engaging with the landscape, there's something of a collision, I'd like to argue, we'll see that at the end, between the local and also the Ottoman experience of the landscape and the type of geometry, if you like, using cadastral maps that was introduced at the very end of the 17th century into the 18th century by the Venetians when they took over the area. So, trying to find these places on the ground might seem relatively simple, and in many cases, I'm deliberately picking ones that are not quite so simple, but in many cases they were. This is an easy one. The place Osmanara was well known in the area, and kind of still around. If you ask people when we were doing the work where that was, they would tell you. But officially, it was changed to Korifasio by Act of Parliament, there you go, in 1915, in response to a request from the local council. And indeed, Politis in the journal Laografia in 1915 outlined the arguments for justifying this particular renaming. He argued there could be no reason to hold on to this barbaric name,
that the name was associated with the area. It was, of course, the name of the nearby promontory, which goes back to classical references, on which the ancient Pylos existed, and the fort of Old Navarino. And he also alludes to the problem of the migrating term Pylos as well, because as you well know, Pylos is not where it was in the Bronze Age, nor is it where it was in the classical period, but is on the south side of the bay. It's been attached to the place that was called Geographical. This was a pattern in 1913 when the northern parts of what is now Greece were incorporated as a result of the Balkan Wars. The Archaeological Society of Athens was very anxious to remove the barbarian names from what was Albania, as it were then, but northern Epirus, I suppose we'd say, and to replace them with the illustrious Greek place names to the renowned homeland of Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus. So there was a sort of systematic renaming and removal of accreted so-called barbarian names. And we see this in an 1835 map where it's difficult to read, but this says Osmanaga, and the 1977, as it happens, 1 to 50,000 Greek map says Koryphasio, not surprisingly. But what do you do when a place doesn't exist, or you don't have this kind of documentation? Well, the first place, Ali Hodja, you can't find a road sign for it. You can't find it very easily on a map. But in fact, it does appear on a map. You might not be able to read it, but that says Ali Hodja. And indeed, if you go to the field, as I did many, many years ago, that particular spot at the end of the red line is where you'll find some ruins, and that presumably is the place where those houses that are referred to in the document was where Michali and Yanni and Todori actually lived. No longer inhabited, of course. But what about sites that clearly from our archaeological survey belonged to this period, i.e. they had modern and early modern material on them, but we couldn't find a place name on the map or find it easily in the kind of documentation I was talking about. Now, we referred to our sites at the time as posies, places of special interest, because we were quite committed to a certain type of methodology which didn't want to prejudge the nature of the archaeological materials we found on the landscape. So we called them posies, and we had two in particular, posy C4, which was at this particular location on the sides of a low hill, and posy B6, which was on the slope of a hill. And this, by the way, is the nose of the Englianos Ridge. The Bronze Age palace is just up here if you're interested. As it happens, Dimitri Georgacas and Bill McDonald in 1967 completed what I still find is an astonishing piece of work in which they collected well over 10,000 place names, local place names from Messenia. What they were trying to do was to find remnant place names to relate to the Linear B documents, in which they were singularly unsuccessful because the toponymy of the area has been completely wiped, as it were, since that level of antiquity, and replaced with many place names. And even Pylos itself has moved. But Jack and myself, in fact, wound up at this site one day, and we met someone there, and we asked her what the name of the place was, and she said Hassanaga. And sure enough, when you turn to MacDonald and Hope Simpson, toponym number 8452, as you see there, is Hassanaga, and it's associated with the village which is number 242, which is Stragana, just up there, about less than a kilometre away from the site. And so that clearly confirmed the existence of that particular place name on that, well, not necessarily that particular place. That came from the encounter in the location, but the documentation backed up its existence. And indeed, in the early 19th century, a map produced by the Expédition Scientifique de Morée, not in 1935, 1835, I corrected the other slide, I forgot to correct this one. Hassanaga, in fact, is listed in this particular location There's how it appears in the French. And by the way, there's Alichodza in their particular ruine, destroyed in the place that we know it nowadays. And so this Posey C4 was clearly the place Hasanagar. There it is, ringed on the hillside. It has a nice tower house. Obviously, the tower house doesn't go back in its current form to the 18th century, but probably is built on earlier foundations. And material like the ceramics you see in the top left and the old press that you see in the bottom right are clearly identify this as an early site. Now, intriguingly, Hasanagar appears as number 5 on the Ottoman document. So we can actually now link the information on the Ottoman document to a particular location on the landscape and a site that clearly was occupied at the time. But the boundaries of Hasanagar are said to be the Great Valley with the river, and it is next to a reasonably large valley. The Konaki, the villa of the bay, another chiefly called Rustemagar, and the sea, and that's fairly obvious where that is. It's a bit to the west there. Not only that, but if you look at the entry for Rustemagar, which happens to be number 6 on the list, it tells you that those chiefliks, Alafina, Hasanagar, and Rustemagar, are attached and share the same taxes and tarlas, which are pieces of agricultural land. So they must have been quite close to one another. And close enough such that they were, in some senses, a single unit in terms of the way they were exploiting the land and delivering taxes as well. Now, as it happens, to the south of Hasanagar, as I said, we have Posey B6, which we'd given the name Pisaski, which is the nearest little village to that particular place. However, what was its Ottoman name? Well, again, turning to the 19th century French map, the correct date this time, 1835, there is a place, Rustemagar, which is put not too far away from Hasanagar up here. But, interestingly, it's in the wrong place. This is the Englianos Ridge. This is another ridge further down. So it's actually in the wrong place. And we thought, well, this is a bit weird. Why has it been put in the wrong place? And we were lucky enough to be able to go into the National Historical Museum, where item number 1870 is a pre-final draft by the Expedition Scientifique of its map, in which they'd actually got it in the right place. So there's Rustemagar right here. This is Hasanagar's actually not mentioned, but it's over here, and that's the right place. And they'd moved it over and put it up here on the final version. So they made a mistake in creating the final version. But again, it helped to confirm for us that the place that we call Posey B6 was in fact the remains of Rustemagar. We could place that information then in the landscape, and again, ceramics, including a Turkish tobacco pipe, demonstrated that, and you could look right across from the site of Rustemagar to the site of Hasanagar and the tower house across the valley. So we were able to populate, if you like, with the correct names these places in this particular area. And the map on the bottom left, the arrow shows the direction in which the photograph was taken to show the Corofascio area. Now, I'm not going to take you through every single identification that we did. It would take too long, and you would get thoroughly fed up very quickly. But what I think is interesting, one of the things that's interesting about this is that this document was prepared immediately following the Venetian occupation of this particular area. And as part of that conquest and taking over of that area, the Venetians instigated a very intense program of cadastral mapping, of space mapping, of vertical mapping of the properties that they found in this particular area. Unfortunately, the original detailed cadastre doesn't survive for this particular region. But just to give you an example, this is from the region of Ostitsa, a place, Zevgolatio, which is a chiflik, is the way it comes out in Venetian Italian, a place called Rizomilo, And you can see that there's a place name Alopaki, probably, although it's not spelt that way in the text. It's spelt Alapoki in the text. And then a river, the Fiume di Clapanzuna, which forms another boundary of it. Now, I'm not going to take you through the details of the Italian, but just to make the point that what you have here, in fact, is really a hybrid. You have a measured map showing in what we might think of as sort of Cartesian space the boundaries of the holding with toponyms marked on it, but accompanying that a verbal description, which I would argue is what's coming from the people who are describing the boundaries of this particular property. This is not coming from the map. The map is generated on the basis of the verbal description, and so on. And that is a sort of, if you like, a contrast between a sort of space-type geometry introduced by the Venetians and a more performative engagement with the landscape, a more place-based engagement with the landscape by local people who are being encountered by the Venetians. And also because I think the Ottomans did not, certainly until this period, have cadastral maps of this type. It's a contrast between Venetian and an Ottoman practice for the way of recording properties and landscapes and so on. Now, somewhere in this, and I can no longer remember exactly at what point we arrived at this, but Olga Katsiardi, the university, published in 1993 an account, a catalogue of some maps that existed in the Kriegsarchiv in Vienna. And to cut a very long story short, because these, it says forthcoming as well, these are going to be published as a set by the Cultural Foundation of the National Bank, and I'm involved in publishing the Messenia set. But these maps came along and confirmed some of what we were actually, what we'd assumed from using the later French maps and also our informants and so on. So you can see probably, but I'll make it bigger just to be clear, that here we have Villa, the settlement, if you like, Hasanaga, Villa Rustanaga, Villa Kuru, and the boundaries include all of those, and indeed do extend to the sea. And there is a valley there as well. So, I mean, it's not surprising, it's just rather nice to have it confirmed in an actual map. And for various reasons, I think the map dates to around about 1700. It's probably from the sort of phase in which these cadasters were produced is fairly well known. And as I say, sadly, the detailed cadaster, like the one from Vostitza, was either was not completed or is no longer preserved for this particular area. So what this enabled us to do was to generate, as it were, a modern map with the ancient place names, the older place names on it, across the area, showing the boundaries of the region of Anavarin, which is this boundary here, and the neighboring region of Arcadia, which goes up to Kyparissia, and so on. And I know you won't be able to read the particular names on there. I can't read them myself either, even if I look very, very closely at the screen, but that's not the intention. The point to make is that we were able to locate them in space. Now, I mentioned that there were different types of properties that are mentioned. So there are villages, which are shown here as circles. These ones up here. There are chifliks, which are listed as the red stars over here. And the castles, the old and new Navarino, and then the green triangles are these mazra, these uninhabited agricultural areas. So we could also then look at the patterning of those different types of property across the area that we were studying. And mentioned that we thought we could identify the stints by which the information was gathered. This is rather boring, but that's the first two. 3 is over there. 4, 5, and 6 clustered together. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Must have been a long day. 13, well, it's a big place. 14, 15, 16, 17, 18.
19, 20, 21, 22, that must have been quite a long day too, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, again another long day, etc., etc. You get the point. But it is interesting that the numbers, the order in which they're recorded, seems to cluster spatially, suggesting again that this is actually these are actually the stints in which they actually worked. Now, the nomenclature used, the terminology used to describe these different places does vary a little bit. There are three types essentially of place names. One which is simply chieflik of, where the of is a Ottoman personal name, so Osmanaga, Hassanaga, Rustemaga, etc. And then there are others where clearly, as some of you may know, there's a process of chieflikization which seems to happen in this region in the late 17th century, arrested by the Venetians and then reinstated again in the early 18th century by the Ottomans. But what that produces is a double name for places. So you get a name which sometimes survives later as a village name. So Papla is Papulia, Kirmiti is Kremidi, Kremidia, the two Kremidias actually. But it's also known as Mustafara Chiflik or Zefarhodja Chiflik and so on. So a combination of the two. And then a series of simple village names. So Platne is Platanos, Kuchuk Pisaski is little, Pisaski, small Pisaski, the one that is now called Pisaski as opposed to Corifasio, and Pila, of course, is not Pylos, but Pila, not to be confused with Pylos, a smaller village a bit inland from modern Pylos. And when you look at those spatially, you see that villages are furthest away from the coast, in the uplands, which is rather oddly called the Cambos in this particular part of the world. And then the village and Ottoman personal name come down onto the lower reaches, and then the Chiflikia, with personal names only, are in the lower river valleys, the flatter areas, presumably the most rich agricultural areas. And I haven't included the Mazra because they're not, of course, inhabited areas as well. So there is a sort of pattern to that. Those names continue through we assume, and in fact the Ottoman document tells us that they're describing a situation that existed before the Venetian conquest. But we can see in the Venetian map, as we've seen already, that these names turn up. So Ali Khodja, Lafina, Hassanaga, Rustemaga, etc. Are repeated into the Venetian map, and it's particularly noticeable if you move south to the territory of Methoni, where many of these names are, in fact, Ottoman personal names. Methoni was a bigger centre certainly in the 17th century than Navarino. We have in TT 880, this document, a list of all the properties that existed within the fort, the Neocastro, which is shown in this plan here. And in fact, you can actually show again the geographical route by which the scribes took to describe these particular properties. We can, by various landmarks, mosque, hammam, and stuff like that. But the interesting thing about this is that the names of the property owners, which are here on the right in this, some of the property owners on the right in this table, are repeated out on the landscape. So what we seem to have in the Neocastro is the home of the Muslim owners of the properties that were out in the landscape. So Osmanaga, obviously the chieflik of Osmanaga. Mustafaga was an alternative name for the village of Papulia. Muslihuddin Effendi was a place called Kukunara, and Mehmedara, a place called Guli it is, I think. Kurdali Aga, a place called Rudia, as it appears in Ottoman, and Mustafa Çelebi, for example, a place called Muzusta, and all of those exist out in the landscape. So what we seem to have is obviously, and this is not unusual, a centre of population of the Muslims in the Castro, as it were, but their identity, if you like, is reflected out in the landscape through the naming of the properties that they were deriving
an income from. Now that reflects a continuity because if I just go back, the properties that were being described in 1715, 1716 in the Castro were, of course, the properties as recorded in Ottoman records. So there were properties as existed in 1685, let's say, before the Venetians arrived. So they're trying to document a continuity of the land ownership. Now that situation of continuity is played out again on the island of Kythera, if I can extend the sort of Peloponnese to include Kythera, where we have a very rich set of documents comprising census records, birth, marriages and death registers, tax records of both rents, affitti and decaccia, essentially the same kind of regime as we have in the Ottoman documents, and notarial books. And there we're able to see similar things going on in the landscape. So, in these particular entries from the affitti register, the rent register from 1754, these two entities, the first one, the Church of the Madonna, the Beata Vergine, at Frazia, big village in the centre of Kythera, that's its modern manifestation, it exists in real space, owned a set of properties or was responsible for the rent for a set of properties that you see below it. And similarly, a man called Panayoti Kendriotis, who's the son of Manousos, aged 34 in 1753, also had responsible for rents there as well. And these rents are simply mentioned against place names. So Melitina Mavrilimni is another place name, which not the same one, of course, as in Messenia. It's a common name. Kendrocianica up there, and so on. So here we have, in a Venetian context, essentially the same kind of landscape description by terminology, not by map, associated with people. It's a sort of, if you like, a sort of social geographical terminology rather than a sort of spatial representational terminology. And we can place these on the landscape because in many cases the churches still exist, and so you can find the parish centre for these churches. So Kendrocianica, where Kendriotis lived, is there, and it's near a place called Raisianica, and this is shot from right in front of the Beata Vergine at Frazia as well. Not only that, but there in fact was, and a little known fact, an Ottoman register for Kythera, because Kythera was taken over in 1715, returned to the Venetians in 1718 under Pasarovit, but in those 3 years an Ottoman register was produced, and we can compare that with the 18th century census records, and we have the same sort of grouping by parish. That's what the separation here in the Ottoman records are. I should say this has been published in full by Evangelia Balta, and also in summary by Machiel Kiel earlier, but this separates the different parishes here. This is a household, and this is a household as it appears in the Venetian documents. This is actually the 1733 and the 1716. So essentially, again, continuity within different systems. Ottomans only record adult males rather than full families, but essentially the same kind of information. And we have a few bits. We don't have the same detailed census records for Messenia, but we have some references to tax farmers under the Venetians, and we can see in a couple of cases, in the case of the village of Cavalaria, as it appears in Venetian, a man called Danielopoulos, who has property at Kasanaga and Floca, Christo Giannacopolo at Skiliraki and Muzusta, and then just a bit later, that's 1704 document, 1716, the Carrière of Cavallari, the same place, Cavalaria. Among the residents there are Danilou, son of Danilou, so Danielopoulo, and Christo, son of Giannacopoulos, as it were, and his properties are listed. So we have a sort of continuity. We can actually document the same people in place as the tax regimes and the higher levels of authority shift from Venetian, from Ottoman to Venetian and back to Ottoman again, which I think is rather striking. So I hope that I've sort of convinced you that, first of all, that this might be interesting, but mainly that we have this sort of contrasting cartographies, ways in which Venetian Cerigo or Kythera records space in contrast to the Peloponnese, the Morea, but also how the Venetians and the Ottomans bring that space into their documentary recording differently. The idea of a sort of performative geography, a practical engagement with the landscape, more about place than about space. The fact that by the nature of the documents, the Ottoman documents, Muslims are invisible, largely because they didn't pay taxes, but they do appear in some of the major place names. The continuity of rural populations and the stability of place names, particularly small place names, particularly striking in Messenia, as well as, of course, a modern resistance to modern renaming. Many of our informants still use the old names for the villages, despite the fact that they've been changed sometime in the 20s or 30s or even later, and so on. So, con esto, proso quizás.